"I never thought I'd find love at 60, she said. But on the Colorado frontier, fate has a way of striking when hearts are most alone. A weary widow tends her orchard in silence, believing her best years are gone. Then one stormy night, a quiet Amish man rides out of the darkness and saves more than just her barn. But love on the frontier is never simple. The town whispers. The church bell tolls. And railroad men come with papers and rifles, ready to tear her orchard from the roots. In a land where treaties are broken and neighbors turn their backs, she must decide. Trust the man outsiders call strange, or lose the last piece of her life worth fighting for. As fences fall and secrets of the land rise, can two souls find love and justice at 60 years old when the whole town stands against them? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Lightning flashed across the Colorado High Plains as Lainey Jane Collier hurried across her yard, her skirts whipping in the wind. The afternoon had turned dark as pitch, and her chickens needed securing before the storm hit full force. At 60 years old, she knew the signs of a bad one brewing. "Come on, you foolish things," she called, shooing the last of her hens into the coop. The wind pulled at her gray-streaked hair, loosening strands from her neat bun. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now, making the ground shiver beneath her feet. Lainey's eyes darted to her barn. The old structure had weathered many storms, but lately, the roof had begun to sag. Her late husband would have fixed it by now, if he were still here. The thought of Tom brought the familiar ache to her chest. 10 years gone, and still she missed him something fierce. The first fat drops of rain splattered against her face as she latched the chicken coop. By the time she reached the barn, the storm had opened up proper, drumming against the wooden shingles. A crack of thunder made her jump, and then she heard it, the terrible groan of timber giving way. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, grabbing her lantern and rushing inside. Rain was already streaming through gaps in the roof. She could see shingles flying off in the wind, and the main support beam was starting to bow. Lainey propped her shoulder against one of the posts, trying to brace it. Her muscles trembled with the effort. If the roof caved in, she'd lose not just the barn but everything inside. Her wagon, her tools, the hay for winter. She couldn't let that happen. The wind howled through the gaps and cold rain soaked through her dress. "Please, Lord," she prayed through gritted teeth, "give me strength." That's when she saw it, another light, cutting through the darkness outside. At first, she thought it was another lightning flash, but this glow was steady, swaying. A wagon. Lantern dot the light grew closer, and through the sheeting rain, she made out the shape of a horse-drawn wagon. It pulled up outside her barn, and a tall figure jumped down, moving with surprising quickness for his size. "Hello?" she called out, voice nearly lost in the storm's fury. "Who's there?" The man stepped into the barn, carrying his own lantern. In its light, she recognized him, Christian Hochstetler, the Amish widower who'd settled in the valley some months back. She'd seen him at the general store once or twice, but never spoken to him. Without a word, he assessed the situation, then moved to brace another post. His broad shoulders and strong hands made the job look easier than it had been for her. Together, they held the structure steady as the storm raged around them. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the crash of thunder and the occasional creak of timber. Christian worked methodically, using rope from his wagon to secure loose beams, his movements sure despite the poor light. Lainey found herself drawing strength from his calm presence. Finally, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew distant, the rain softening to a gentle patter. In the gray light of dawn, Lainey could see the damage wasn't as bad as she'd feared. Thanks to their efforts, the barn still stood. "Much obliged, Mr. Hochstetler," she said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come along." Christian nodded, wiping rain from his beard. "I saw your light," he said simply. His voice was deep but gentle, with the slight accent she'd heard other Amish folk use. "God guided my path." They were both soaked to the bone and shivering. Lainey straightened her shoulders, summoning her last bit of strength. "Well, least I can do is offer you some hot coffee. That is, if you're allowed." She wasn't sure about Amish rules regarding such things. A small smile touched Christian's lips. Coffee would be welcome. In her kitchen, Lainey stoked the cook stove, while Christian removed his wet coat. She set her best tin cups on the table, filling them with strong, hot coffee. The familiar routine of hosting felt strange after so many years alone, but not unpleasant as they sat across from each other, warming their hands on their cups. Lainey felt something stir in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. She found herself studying Christian's weathered face in the lamplight, noting the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his work-worn hands. "Strange how the Lord works," she said softly, almost to herself, "sending help in the middle of a storm." Christian took a sip of his coffee, nodding thoughtfully. "He moves in mysterious ways," he agreed, and something in his voice made Lainey think he might be feeling that same surprising warmth. Morning light filtered through the breaking clouds, revealing the storm's aftermath across Lainey's orchard. Broken apple branches littered the muddy ground, and puddles reflected the pale sky like scattered mirrors. The air smelled fresh and clean, though tinged with wet wood and sodden earth. Christian Hochstetler stood in the barn doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the plank floor. His steady hands moved along the rafters, checking each beam and joint with careful attention. Lainey watched from nearby, struck by how different he looked in daylight. His beard neatly trimmed, his black coat showing signs of wear but well maintained. "Main supports held," he said, his voice carrying that gentle certainty she'd noticed during the night. "But these crossbeams will need attention soon." Lainey nodded, trying not to stare at how his presence seemed to fill the old barn with something more than just his physical size. "You saved my barn last night, Mr. Hochstetler. I can't thank you enough." He turned from his inspection, meeting her eyes with a direct but kind gaze. "Please call me Christian." He paused, then added, "I live with our settlement, about 3 miles north. We keep to ourselves mostly, following the old ways." "The old ways?" Lainey asked, curious despite herself. "Yeah, simple living, no violence." His hands, work-roughened but gentle, gestured to his plain clothes. "We believe in peace and helping our neighbors when God calls us to serve." Lainey smoothed her apron, suddenly aware of her rumpled appearance after the long night. "Well, at least let me give you some eggs for your trouble. My hens are good layers, and—" Christian held up a hand, shaking his head. "No payment needed. It's what neighbors do." He moved toward his wagon, which stood waiting in the yard. The horses stamped impatiently, eager to be home as he hitched his team. Lainey couldn't help but notice how efficiently he worked, each movement purposeful and sure. When he climbed onto the wagon seat, he tipped his broad-brimmed hat to her. "God be with you, Mrs. Collier." "And with you," she replied, watching until his wagon disappeared around the bend. Later that afternoon, Lainey made her weekly trip into town for supplies. The mercantile's bell jingled as she entered, and she immediately sensed something different in the air. Mrs. Peterson and Sarah Jenkins stood near the fabric bolts, their heads closed together in whispered conversation. They straightened when they saw her, offering smiles that seemed a touch too bright. "Afternoon, Lainey," Mrs. Peterson called out. "Quite a storm last night." "Indeed it was," Lainey replied, moving toward the dried goods shelf. "Heard you had some help with your barn," Sarah added, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested more questions lurked beneath the surface. "One of those Amish folk, wasn't it?" Lainey selected a bag of flour, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, Mr. Hochstetler was kind enough to stop when he saw I was in trouble." More customers filtered in, and Lainey felt their curious glances. She heard fragments of whispered conversations, Widow Collier and that Amish man, floating between the shelves. She paid for her supplies and left, holding her head high despite the heat in her cheeks. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, a bowl of stew and a slice of bread before her. The house felt especially quiet after the drama of the previous night. Steam rose from her bowl as she remembered Christian's calm voice, the sure movement of his hands as he worked to save her barn. Those hands had seemed to know exactly what needed doing, carrying an assurance she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Rising from the table, she washed her dishes and prepared for bed. The lamp cast a warm glow across her small bedroom as she sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her hair. 60 years old, and here she was, thinking about a man like some young girl. I never thought I'd find love at 60, she said aloud, then chuckled at her own foolishness. The sound of her voice in the quiet room made her shake her head at herself. A knock at her door cut through the evening silence, making her start. She hadn't heard a wagon approach. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she moved cautiously to the door. Lamp in hand. There on her porch stood Christian Hochstetler, his wagon visible in the yard behind him. A stack of lumber lay in the bed. "Your barn needs proper repair," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to appear at a widow's door after sunset. "I brought materials to fix those crossbeams." Lainey stood speechless for a moment, the lamp trembling slightly in her hand. Something warm bloomed in her chest at the sight of him. This quiet man who had come back, not out of duty this time, but because he chose to. "Would you like to come in?" she finally managed, stepping back from the door. "I could make some coffee." The next morning dawned clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Lainey woke early, her muscles aching from the storm night, but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. Through her kitchen window, she spotted Christian's wagon approaching, right on time as promised. He brought not just the lumber she'd seen last night, but also a carpenter's toolbox that spoke of years of careful use. Each tool lay perfectly arranged, handles worn smooth from countless projects. The sight reminded her of her late husband's methodical ways, though the similarity brought comfort rather than pain. "Good morning," Christian called softly, already assessing the barn's damage in the morning light. "The weather looks to hold fair for our work." Together they set about their task, falling into an easy rhythm. Christian worked with quiet efficiency, measuring twice before each cut, his saw sliding through wood with practiced strokes. Lainey found herself naturally filling the role of helper, steadying boards while he aligned them and passing nails up as needed. The morning passed in comfortable industry, broken only by the occasional request for a tool or a word of guidance. The barn's interior rang with the steady rhythm of hammering, punctuated by the soft cooing of doves in the rafters. As the sun climbed toward noon, Lainey brought out a simple meal, fresh bread, apple butter, and bright red apples from last fall's harvest. They sat in the shade of the barn's entrance, the spring breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut lumber. "These apples kept well," Christian remarked, turning the fruit in his weathered hands. Something in his expression shifted, growing distant yet soft. My Sarah, she knew just how to store apples through winter, had a special way of wrapping each one in paper. Lainey's hands stilled on her bread. This was the first time he'd mentioned his wife by name. "She died in childbirth," he continued quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Our 6th child. Both were called home to God that day." He paused, taking a careful bite of apple before adding, "The other children are grown now, married with families of their own. All moved east to Pennsylvania, near their mother's kin." "I'm so sorry," Lainey said softly, recognizing the familiar shape of such grief. "My Thomas passed from fever 4 years ago. Our children moved west to California, chasing dreams of orange groves." Christian nodded, understanding in his eyes. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sharing the simple meal and the deeper communion of those who've walked similar paths. After lunch, Lainey suggested a walk through her orchard. The apple trees stood in neat rows, their branches beginning to show the first promise of spring. Tiny buds dotted the twigs, still tightly closed but holding all the potential of the coming season. Christian stopped at one gnarled old tree, running his hand along its bark with something like reverence. "These trees," he said thoughtfully, "they're like people sometimes. All their strength lies in roots you cannot see, reaching deep into good soil." Lainey looked at the old tree with new eyes, thinking of her own roots in this land, of the years of care she and Thomas had poured into each row. "Yes," she agreed softly, "though sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to tend them alone." "The Lord provides helpers when we need them most," Christian replied, his voice gentle but certain. They finished the barn repairs as afternoon stretched toward evening. The new beams stood strong and true, promising many more years of service. As Christian packed his tools into his wagon, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I'll return in 3 days," he said, climbing onto the wagon. "Seat, that fence needs mending before your cattle discover the gap." Lainey nodded, surprised by how much she looked forward to his return. "Thank you, Christian, for everything." After his wagon disappeared around the bend, Lainey went about her evening tasks with a lighter heart than she'd felt in years. The simple work of the day, shared with understanding company, had soothed something deep within her that she hadn't even realized was aching. Later, as she moved through the house closing shutters for the night, a movement near her property line caught her eye. 2 men in crisp railroad uniforms stood in the falling dusk, consulting papers and driving stakes into the ground. One tied strips of red cloth to the stakes, the bright fabric fluttering like warning flags in the evening breeze. A chill ran through her, despite the mild spring air. She'd heard whispers in town about the railroad pushing through the valley, but seeing these men so close to her land made the threat suddenly real. They moved with the confidence of those who believed the land already belonged to them. Though no one had approached her about purchasing her property, Lainey closed the final shutter with trembling hands, her earlier peace shattered by the sight of those red markers standing like sentinels at the edge of her world. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when sharp knocking startled Lainey from her breakfast prayers. Through the curtained window, she glimpsed a stranger in a pressed suit standing on her porch, his polished boots gleaming. "Mrs. Collier?" The man tipped his hat as she opened the door. "I'm Agent Calloway with the Western Rail Company." He pulled papers from his leather satchel, holding them like cards in a winning hand. "I've come to discuss the purchase of your property for our new spur line." Lainey's throat tightened. "Purchase? Yes, ma'am. The railroad has rights to claim land for expansion." He spread the documents across her kitchen table, pointing to official-looking stamps and signatures. "We're prepared to offer $800 for the full parcel." "800?" Lainey steadied herself against a chair. "This orchard produces more than that in a single season. It's my livelihood. Progress requires sacrifice, Mrs. Collier." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "The railroad will bring prosperity to this valley. Surely you understand the greater good?" "What I understand is that this land was deeded to my husband and me 20 years ago." Lainey's voice grew stronger. "We planted every tree by hand. I won't sell." The agent's expression hardened. "I strongly suggest you reconsider. The railroad has ways of acquiring necessary land, with or without cooperation." He gathered his papers, leaving one face up on the table. "You have 1 week to accept our offer." By afternoon, whispers had already spread through town like wildfire. Lainey felt eyes following her as she delivered eggs to the mercantile. Behind shelves of dry goods, she heard murmured conversations fall silent at her approach. "Poor widow Collier. Can't fight the railroad. Bound to lose everything." Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Laney donned her best dress and walked the familiar path to the white-painted church, trying to ignore the pitying glances from other parishioners. The worn wooden pews creaked as the congregation settled for service. Reverend Matthew's sermon dwelt unusually long on the virtues of progress and accepting God's will for change. His eyes found Laney's more than once as he spoke of sacrifice. For the community's good. After the final hymn, he caught her sleeve gently. "Sister Laney, might I have a word?" She noticed several deacons lingering nearby, straining to hear. "I understand you've had visitors from the railroad," the Reverend said softly. "We must be careful not to stand in the way of Providence. The town needs this connection to prosper." "Providence didn't plant my trees," Laney replied, keeping her voice steady. "Nor did it tend them through drought and frost these 20 years. Before the Reverend could respond, Christian appeared at her elbow. His calm presence steadied her racing heart. "If I may," he said quietly, "legal papers often bear closer examination. Railroad claims must align with existing treaties and property rights." The Reverend's lips thinned. "Mr. Hochstetler, this is a delicate matter." "Indeed it is," Christian agreed mildly. "Which is why careful consideration serves better than hasty decisions." He fell into step beside Laney as they left the church, his measured pace matching hers. Though he didn't offer his arm, that would be too forward for his Amish ways, his presence beside her felt like a shield. "My father was a reader of law," he said as they walked. "He taught me that railroad companies often overlook older treaties in their haste. Perhaps we might examine your deed more closely." They passed the mercantile, where several women gathered on the porch ceased their conversation abruptly. A rancher leading his horse passed spat into the dust. "Strange company for a widow," he muttered, loud enough to carry. Laney's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. Christian seemed not to notice the slight, though she saw his hands clasped more tightly behind his back. That evening, kneeling beside her bed, Laney pressed her forehead against clasped hands. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't ask for much. But this land, these trees, they're all I have left of the life Thomas and I built. Please show me the path forward." Rising to close her curtains, she caught sight of a wagon light moving slowly along the northern road. Christian, heading home to his own quiet house. The small, steady light bobbed through the darkness like a reminder of hope. She watched until it disappeared behind the ridge, then turned to her empty house. The railroad's paper still lay on her kitchen table, its threats softened by shadow but no less real in the gathering dark. 2 days after the church confrontation, Christian's wagon rattled up Laney's dusty drive, loaded with leather-bound books and yellowed papers. The morning sun cast long shadows as he carefully carried his precious cargo to her kitchen table. "County records," he explained, spreading out brittle maps and documents. "And some territorial papers my father collected years ago." Laney cleared breakfast dishes to make room, wiping crumbs from the worn tablecloth. "You really think we might find something?" "The Lord often leaves traces of truth if we look carefully." Christian adjusted his black hat before sitting down. His weathered fingers traced careful lines across an old survey map. They worked through the morning hours, reading by sunlight that streamed through Laney's curtains. The quiet was broken only by the rustle of pages and occasional murmur as they shared discoveries. Near noon, Christian's fingers stopped suddenly on a faded document. "Here." He leaned forward, squinting at spidery handwriting. "This treaty from 1852, it mentions this exact parcel of land." Laney moved closer, her shoulder nearly touching his as she read. "The Ute family, the Red Feathers. Says here they were granted permanent rights to this stream and the surrounding 100 acres, which would include your orchard." Christian carefully turned the page. The treaty was signed by territorial officials. It was never properly voided. So, the railroad can't claim land that was promised to others. Hope flickered in Laney's chest. "Not legally, but Christian hesitated. Finding the red feather descendants, involving them in this dispute, it could anger many people. The railroad men, the townsfolk. Truth is truth, Laney said firmly. If this land was promised to that family, they should know. Maybe together we can stop the railroad from taking what isn't theirs to take. Christian nodded slowly. You have courage, Laney Jane Collier. The warmth in his voice made her cheeks flush. Before she could respond, heavy boots clomped on her porch. Without knocking, 3 men pushed through her door. Harold from the feed store, Thomas Baker who ran the mercantile, and William Jones who served on the town council. Evening, Widow Collier. Harold's usual friendly tone had an edge. Thought. We ought to have a word. Christian rose quietly, moving to stand beside Laney's chair. The maps and documents still lay scattered across the table. What's this about? Laney asked, though she already knew. Folk are talking, William Jones said. About you keeping company with. He glanced at Christian. Well, with those who don't mix with regular folk. And now we hear you're fixing to cause trouble about old Indian treaties. We're concerned for your reputation, Thomas Baker added. Your dear husband, God rest him, was a respected man. Wouldn't want his good name tarnished. My husband believed in doing what was right, Laney said evenly, even when it wasn't easy. The railroad means progress. Harold stepped closer. Jobs, growth. Can't let old papers and foreign notions stand in the way of that. Foreign notions? Christian's quiet voice made them all turn. Like honesty? Keeping promises? Those seem American enough to me. William Jones' face darkened. Nobody asked you, Amisher. Best you head back to your own kind. Mr. Hochstetler is my guest. Laney stood, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. And you gentlemen weren't invited at all. The 3 men exchanged glances. Harold cleared his throat. Just trying to help, Widow Collier. But if you're set on this foolishness, he settled his hat firmly. Don't expect folks to stand with you when it all goes wrong. They filed out, boots heavy on her porch steps. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. You didn't have to stay, Laney said softly, still looking at the door. Yes, Christian replied. I did. She turned to face him then, seeing the quiet strength in his weathered face, the compassion in his steady gaze. The setting sun through her window caught silver threads in his beard, turned his plain black coat to shadow. I'm afraid, she admitted. Not of them exactly, but of being alone in this fight. You aren't alone. His words were simple but carried the weight of promise. Looking at him in the fading light, Laney realized she trusted this gentle man completely, though she'd known him barely a week. There was something solid about him, like the old trees in her orchard, rooted deep, weathering storms without breaking. The evening air cooled around them as shadows lengthened across her kitchen floor. Outside, a whip-poor will called lonesome. Welcome to the coming night. On her table, the treaty papers lay waiting, holding both threat and hope in their faded ink. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Laney packed her wagon with supplies while Christian hitched her sturdy bay horse. The wooden wheels creaked as they set out, heading north toward the Ute Reservation 40 miles distant. Reckon it'll take us 2 days, Laney said, settling the reins in her hands. Her old traveling dress rustled in the morning breeze. Christian nodded, his black hat shading his eyes. The trail is rough past Miller's Creek. We'll need to take it slow. They traveled through rolling grassland, the wagon swaying over uneven ground. Dust rose in clouds around the wheels, coating their clothes and settling in their hair. The sun climbed higher, beating down on their backs. Near midday, Christian opened his worn Bible, the pages fluttering in the warm wind. If I may? At Laney's. Nod, he read softly, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. The familiar words brought comfort. Laney felt her shoulders relax, tension easing despite the jolting wagon. Here's another that speaks to me, Christian continued. Be patient therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth. He smiled gently. Scenes fitting for an orchard keeper. The afternoon stretched long as they followed the winding trail. Their conversation flowed easily between quiet stretches, touching on memories of seasons past and hopes for harvests to come. When the sun began to sink, they made camp beside a clear-running creek. Christian gathered dry wood while Lainey set up their cooking fire. The familiar routine of camp work felt different with a companion, lighter somehow, almost pleasant. She couldn't remember the last time she'd traveled with anyone beside her. Late husband. The aroma of beans bubbling in the iron pot mixed with fresh coffee. They sat on fallen logs, watching sparks rise toward emerging stars. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere an owl called. It's been years since I camped under open sky, Lainey admitted, cradling her tin cup. Forgot how peaceful it can be. Christian's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. The Lord's cathedral has no walls. They set out again at first light, following the trail as it wound through scattered pine and scrub oak. By mid-afternoon, they spotted the agency buildings, weathered wooden structures flying an American flag. Samuel Red Elk met them in the agent's office, his dignity apparent in his straight posture and steady gaze. Gray streaked his long dark hair, and his face held years of wisdom. He listened intently as Lainey explained about her orchard and the railroad's threats. We found mentions of your people's treaty rights to that land, she said, spreading out their copied documents. The Red Feather family's claim from 1852. Samuel nodded slowly, moving to a locked cabinet. He returned with carefully preserved papers, laying them beside Lainey's copies. These are our records of that same treaty. The marks of my grandfather's brother are here. He traced the faded signatures with gentle fingers. The stream you speak of, we called it Singing Waters. The fruit trees that grow there now, they stand where our people once gathered berries and medicinal plants. The land is included in the treaty boundaries, he confirmed, comparing the maps. But I must warn you, white courts often have selective memory when it comes to such promises. Lainey straightened her shoulders. If we succeed in stopping the railroad, I give you my word, your people will always be welcome to gather fruit there. The orchard can be shared, as it should have been all along. Samuel studied her face for a long moment. I believe you speak with a true heart. He carefully rolled the treaties. We will provide copies of our records to support your claim. The sun was setting by the time they finished discussing details and copying documents. Stars were beginning to shine as Lainey and Christian started their journey home. The wagon swayed gently through the gathering darkness. Lainey held the precious treaty papers close, aware of their significance. Beside her, Christian's solid presence offered silent support. Do you think it will be enough? She asked quietly. Truth has its own power, he replied. Whatever comes, we face it with clear conscience. They rode on under the star-filled sky, each lost in thought about the challenge ahead. The weight of what they carried, both paper and promise, settled around them like a heavy blanket in the cool night air. 3 days after returning from the Ute reservation, Lainey sealed the thick envelope with trembling fingers. Inside lay copies of the treaty documents, along with her formal letter to the county court explaining her land claim. She smoothed the address one final time before walking to the post office. The morning sun warmed her shoulders as she made her way down the dusty street. A few townsfolk nodded stiffly, their usual warm greetings notably absent. Outside the mercantile, Mrs. Peterson turned away pointedly, hustling her children inside. Christian's wagon waited by the produce market, loaded with crates of Lainey's stored winter apples and preserves. His steady hands helped her arrange her goods on the wooden counter, each jar gleaming in the sunlight. Much obliged, she said softly, noting how his presence drew sideways glances from other vendors. A group of men near the hardware store muttered among themselves, casting dark looks their way. "Pay them no mind," Christian murmured, carefully stacking empty crates. Their words hold no weight against truth. The market day stretched long, marked by whispered conversations that died when Lainey approached and customers who avoided her stand entirely. Only the Miller children dared stop by, their mother hurriedly pulling them away after they purchased a jar of apple butter dot as Lainey packed up her unsold goods. Reverend Matthews approached, his expression troubled. "Sister Collier, might I have a word?" He drew her aside, speaking in low tones. "I'm concerned about the path you're choosing. Associating with outsiders, stirring up old treaties. It's causing talk." "Reverend," Lainey replied firmly, straightening her spine, "I respect your counsel, but God's truth matters more than gossip. The railroad means to take what isn't rightfully theirs. The town needs progress, sister. And you," he hesitated, glancing at Christian, "you need to consider your reputation." "My reputation rests with the Lord," she said quietly. "And He knows what's in my heart." The Reverend shook his head sadly before walking away. Lainey watched him go, fighting back tears of frustration. That evening, Christian helped carry her remaining produce home. The kitchen filled with warmth as she heated a pot of stew, setting out fresh bread and butter. They sat together at her small table, the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. "I never thought to find companionship again," Christian said suddenly, his voice gentle in the quiet room. "After Sarah passed, I believe those days were behind me." Lainey's hands stilled on her spoon. Her heart quickened at his words, though she kept her eyes on her bowl. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she replied softly. "Sometimes He sends blessings we never expected." Christian nodded, understanding passing between them in the lamplight. When he rose to leave, Lainey walked him to the door. The evening air carried the scent of approaching autumn. "Thank you," she whispered, "for your friendship." The word felt inadequate somehow, but it was all she dared say. His smile warmed his eyes. "Good night, Lainey Jane." He touched his hat brim and headed for his wagon. She watched until his lantern light disappeared around the bend, then secured her door for the night. Sleep came easily, despite the day's tensions, the peace shattered with dawn's first light. Lainey stepped onto her porch and froze. Her orchard fence lay broken in several places, posts splintered and wire cut. Among the trees, tender saplings she'd planted that spring lay crushed and broken. Her hands shook as she surveyed the damage. Muddy boot prints marked the ground, accompanied by wooden stakes painted with railroad markings. They'd been thrown carelessly among her trampled trees, a clear message of defiance. Nausea rose in her throat as she knelt beside a damaged sapling. 3 years of careful tending, destroyed in one night of spite. These trees had been meant for her grandchildren's future. Now they lay broken in the mud. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. Through tears she hadn't realized were falling, she saw Christian dismounting from his horse. He took in the scene with grave eyes, then moved quietly to stand beside her. "They mean to drive me out," Lainey said, her voice rough with emotion. "To frighten me into selling." Christian's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "Then they don't know your strength," he replied firmly, "nor the power of standing in truth." She drew a shaky breath, finding comfort in his steady presence. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across her violated orchard. The damage was done, but Lainey straightened her shoulders. She would not be driven from her land by bullies and threats. Christian's wagon rattled down the road at a furious pace when word reached him about the orchard's destruction. He'd been helping a neighbor raise fence posts when young Tommy Miller raced up on his pony, breathlessly describing the damage. Without hesitation, Christian hitched his team and headed for Lainey's land. The sight of the devastation made his heart ache. Tender saplings lay broken and twisted, their bark stripped by rough hands. Lainey knelt among them, her fingers gently touching each damaged limb as if comforting a wounded child. "We can save some," Christian said softly, kneeling beside her. "The roots might still be strong." They worked through the morning heat, carefully straightening what trees they could and bracing them with splints. Christian's carpenter's hands moved surely, binding the young trunks while Laney packed soil around their bases. But for every sapling they managed to save, 3 more were beyond help. Wagons and riders passed on the nearby road throughout the day. Some slowed to stare. Others hurried past with averted eyes. Not one stopped to offer assistance. The silence of their neighbors spoke volumes. As the sun began to sink, Laney's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. 3 years of tending, she murmured, gone in one night of meanness. Christian straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "The Lord sees their works," he said quietly, "and yours." The clatter of approaching hooves drew their attention. The telegraph boy rode up, waving a yellow envelope. "Message for Widow Collier." Laney's hands trembled slightly as she opened the telegram. Her eyes widened as she read the brief message. "The county court," she said. "They'll hear my case in 2 weeks' time." Relief washed over her face, quickly followed by anxiety. Christian watched the emotions play across her features, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. "It's a chance to speak truth," he said gently. "To stand firm in what's right." They made their way to the house as evening settled in. Laney lit the lamp while Christian brought in fresh water from the well. The familiar tasks helped calm her nerves, though her hand still shook slightly as she set out cups for tea. The lamplight cast a warm glow as they sat at her kitchen table. Neither spoke for a long moment, both lost in thought. Finally, Laney broke the silence. "My youngest, Sarah, wrote last week from California," she said softly. "She's expecting her second child come spring." A smile touched her lips, though her eyes held sadness. So far away, all of them. James in Oregon, William in Washington Territory. "Sometimes I wonder if I did right, encouraging them to seek their own paths." Christian nodded slowly. "I understand." "My children," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "They're scattered too. Daniel and Ruth in Ohio, Rebecca in Kansas. Each letter brings joy, but also reminder of the distance. Do you ever regret?" Laney asked quietly, "Letting them go so far?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but they must follow where the Lord leads, as must we." The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. In the distance, a train whistle cut through the night, closer than it had been even a week ago. Laney shivered slightly at the sound. "The tracks advanced so quickly," she murmured, "like a great snake eating up the land." Christian's eyes held steady understanding. "But they haven't reached your orchard yet. And now you have a chance to be heard." Laney looked out at the darkness beyond her window. Her trees stood as darker shadows against the night sky, their branches swaying in the rising wind. So fragile they seemed, yet they had weathered storms before. Like herself, she thought, bent. Sometimes, but not broken. The warmth of Christian's presence filled the kitchen, as steady and comforting as the lamplight. She found herself grateful for his quiet strength, his unwavering support through these troubled days. It eased the loneliness that had been her constant companion since her husband's passing. "Lord, keep me steady," she whispered, the prayer rising unbidden to her lips. Christian bowed his head slightly, adding his own silent petition to hers. The train whistled again, more distant now. But Laney knew it would return, bringing with it the forces that threatened her home. Yet somehow, with Christian's solid presence across the table and the promise of a hearing before the court, she felt hope stirring alongside her fear. The lamp flickered as another gust rattled the windows. Outside, her wounded orchard stood brave against the wind, its remaining trees anchored deep in soil that had nourished them for decades. Like those trees, Laney resolved to stand firm, drawing strength from roots of faith and the unexpected blessing of companionship in her time of trial. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over the Colorado plains. Lainey smoothed her best black dress and pinned her gray hair neatly beneath her bonnet. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the clasp of her mother's silver brooch. She hadn't worn it in years, but today felt important somehow. Christian's wagon appeared right on time, his team of horses gleaming in the early light. He stepped down to help her up, his strong hands steady and respectful. He wore simple black clothing in the Amish way, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes kind beneath the brim of his hat. "Good morning, Lainey," he said softly. "Ready for service?" She nodded, settling beside him on the wagon seat. The familiar creak of leather and wood accompanied them down the dusty road toward town. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable between them. As they approached the white-painted church, heads turned. Women gathered on the steps paused in their conversations. Men loading their pipes by the hitching posts stared openly. Christian helped Lainey down from the wagon as whispers rustled through the morning air like dry leaves. Inside, they found seats near the back, though Lainey usually sat closer to the front. More whispers followed them. Mrs. Peterson, who had brought Lainey's soup when she was sick last winter, barely nodded as she passed. The Baker children, usually quick to wave, huddled closer to their mother. The service began with familiar hymns. Lainey sang quietly, aware of the sideways glances from nearby pews. Then Reverend Matthews made an unexpected announcement. "Brothers and sisters, we have among us today Christian Hochstetler, who I'm told has a gift for sacred song. Would you favor us with a hymn in your native German, brother?" A hushed tension filled the room. Christian rose slowly, removed his hat, and bowed slightly. Then his deep voice filled the church with the ancient words of Großer Gott, where Loben ditch. Though few understood the German lyrics, the reverence in his tone needed no translation. Lainey recognized the melody as "Holy God, we praise thy name." Without planning to, she began to sing the English words softly. Their voices blended naturally, his rich bass supporting her clear alto. Other voices gradually joined in, first a few, then more, until the small church rang with harmony. When the last note faded, a different kind of silence fell, not the tense quiet of before, but something softer. Reverend Matthews nodded approvingly, and Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the service, Christian walked beside Lainey toward his wagon. "Music speaks to the heart," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it helps us see past our differences to what matters most." "Faith should unite us," Lainey agreed, though men seemed determined to draw lines between themselves. The peaceful moment proved short-lived. That afternoon, while Lainey was setting out feed for her chickens, a group of townspeople gathered at her gate. She recognized Thomas Fuller, the mercantile owner, and several prominent ranchers' wives among them. "Widow Collier," Fuller called out, his voice harsh. "We've come to speak plain. You're bringing shame on this community." Lainey set down her feed bucket and walked to the gate, her heart pounding but her step steady. "How so, Mr. Fuller?" "Consorting with this Amish fellow. Stirring up trouble about old Indian treaties. It ain't proper," Mrs. Henderson cut in. "What would your poor husband say?" "My husband believed in truth and justice," Lainey replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "As do I. Truth is, you're standing in the way of progress," Fuller snapped. "And taking up with outsiders won't help your cause." They left soon after, but their words hung in the air like storm clouds. Lainey stood at the gate long after they'd gone. Fighting back tears she refused to shed. Christian appeared as the sun was setting, tools in hand. Without a word, he began fixing the gate where someone had loosened its hinges. The steady rhythm of his hammer provided strange comfort. "They aim to shake your resolve," he said finally, testing the gate's swing. "But truth demands endurance, Lainey. Like your trees, deep roots weather many storms." The setting sun painted the orchard in shades of gold and amber. Lainey watched the light play through the leaves of her surviving trees. Despite the day's turmoil, a moment of peace settled over her as gentle as evening dew. Christian stood beside her, solid as an oak, while the beautiful light transformed her wounded orchard into something almost holy. For that brief, golden moment, she could believe that peace was possible, that truth and justice might prevail. After all, 3 days after the church service, Lainey woke to the sound of thundering hooves. Her heart leaped into her throat as she hurried to the window. Through the early morning mist, she saw 6 railroad men on horseback, rifles glinting across their saddles. They rode straight for her orchard fence, the lead rider a burly man with a red bandana swung down from his horse. Without hesitation, he grabbed a fence post and began wrenching it free. His companions joined him, their boots churning mud as they tore through her property. Lainey ran outside, her shawl flying behind her. "Stop, you have no right." The men ignored her, pushing deeper into the orchard rows. Young apple trees, barely as tall as her shoulder, bent and snapped under the horse's hooves. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as more fencing gave way. Christian's wagon appeared on the road, moving fast. He must have heard the commotion from his morning rounds. He pulled up hard by the gate, jumping down before his team had fully stopped. "This must cease." Christian's voice carried across the yard, firm but calm. He strode toward the railroad men, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. "The law will decide this matter, not violence." The man in the red bandana turned, sneering. "Ain't you the Amish fellow? Best mind your own business, old man." Christian kept walking, his eyes fixed on the leader. "I cannot stand idle while you destroy what belongs to another." "Can't you now?" The man swung his rifle around, using it like a club. The heavy stock caught Christian across the temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground. "No!" Lainey screamed, running forward. The other men laughed as their leader mounted up, all of them wheeling their horses around to ride off through the ruined fence line. Lainey fell to her knees beside Christian. Blood trickled from a deep gash near his hairline, staining his gray beard. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. She gathered his head into her lap, her tears falling onto his still face. "Please, Lord," she prayed aloud, her voice breaking. "Please spare him. I cannot lose him too." Young Tommy Fisher, who helped with her chickens some mornings, came running from the road. His eyes went wide at the sight of Christian lying in the mud. "Tommy," Lainey called, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Help me get him inside. Then fetch Dr. Wilson." Together, they managed to half-carry, half-drag Christian's small frame into the house. They laid him on Lainey's bed, the only one on the ground floor. Tommy raced off toward town while Lainey heated water and gathered clean cloths. Her hands shook as she washed away the blood and mud. The wound looked terrible in the lamplight, swollen and dark. Christian didn't stir as she worked, even when she pressed the hot compress against the gash. Hour after hour, she sat beside him. The doctor came and went, leaving herbs for tea and instructions to keep Christian still if he woke. If he woke, those words echoed in Lainey's mind as darkness fell. She lit her lamp and settled into her rocking chair beside the bed. Outside, a coyote called into the night. The sound reminded her of how alone they were out here, how vulnerable. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she kept her vigil. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet room, "I know I'm old to be feeling such things, but this man has brought light back into my days. His kindness, his strength, I need them both. Please don't take him from me. From me." She dozed fitfully as the hours crept past midnight. The lamp burned low, casting shadows on Christian's pale face. She had just risen to trim the wick when she heard him stir. "Christian?" She leaned close, taking his rough hand in hers. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they found her face in the dim light. "The orchard," he whispered hoarsely. "Do not let them take the orchard." Tears spilled down Laney's cheeks as she gripped his hand tighter. "I won't," she promised. "I'll fight for every tree, every inch of soil." She touched his face gently. "And for you, Christian. You gave my heart new hope when I thought such feelings were long past. I'll fight for that too." He managed a small smile before his eyes drifted closed again, but this time his sleep seemed natural. Laney sat back in her chair, still holding his hand. Through her window, she could see the first hint of dawn touching the eastern sky. Another day was coming, bringing with it more battles to face. But she was no longer facing them alone. The railroad men had meant to break her spirit. Instead, they had only made it stronger. Like her beloved apple trees, she would bend but not break. With Christian beside her, she would stand firm until justice prevailed. For 3 long days, Laney barely left Christian's bedside. She spooned warm chicken broth between his pale lips and changed the bandages that wrapped his temple with trembling fingers. The wound had begun to heal, but angry purple bruising spread across his forehead like storm clouds. The house felt eerily quiet. No neighbors came to call, no concerned faces appeared at her door. Only the gentle clucking of her hens and the whisper of wind through apple trees broke the silence. Laney understood the message clear enough. The town had chosen its side, and it wasn't hers. On the second evening, just as dusk painted the sky purple, a soft knock startled her. Laney opened her door cautiously to find Sarah Miller, the kind-hearted wife of a nearby rancher, standing there with a covered pail. "Fresh milk," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I wish I could do more, but Tom would be mighty upset if he knew I came." Laney squeezed the woman's hand. "Much obliged, Sarah. The Lord sees your kindness." Sarah hurried away into the gathering dark, leaving Laney grateful for even this small show of support. By the 3rd day, Christian had improved enough to sit up in bed. His eyes were clearer, though pain still creased his brow. When Laney mentioned the upcoming court hearing, set for the next morning, he gripped her arm with surprising strength. "You must go," he insisted, his voice hoarse but firm. "The truth needs speaking, even if I cannot stand steady." Laney shook her head. "You're not well enough for such a journey." "I will manage." Christian's jaw set with determination. "You showed courage facing those men alone. Now let me show mine by standing beside you." Dawn of the 4th day found them preparing the wagon, Christian moving slowly but deliberately. Laney packed bread, cheese, and apples for the journey, along with clean bandages and herbs for Christian's wound. She helped him climb carefully onto the wooden seat, tucking a quilt around his legs against the morning chill. The road to the county seat stretched 40 miles across the high plains. Every bump and rut sent jolts through the wagon, making Christian wince. Yet he never complained, even when the sun climbed high and hot overhead. They stopped twice to rest the horses and allow Christian to stretch his stiff limbs. "The Lord provides strength," he said softly when Laney fretted over his discomfort, "and purpose makes the path easier." Evening shadows were lengthening when they finally reached the county seat. The small town's dusty streets were quiet as Laney guided their wagon to a modest inn near the courthouse. The innkeeper's wife clucked sympathetically at Christian's obvious injury, showing them to a simple room with 2 narrow beds. After a sparse supper of beans and cornbread in the inn's kitchen, they returned to their room. The candle on the bedside table cast flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. Without discussion, they both sank to their knees beside Christian's bed. "Dear Lord," Christian began, his deep voice steady despite his weakness, "grant us wisdom and courage for tomorrow's trial. Let truth prevail over greed, justice over power. And protect this good man," Laney added softly, her eyes closed tight against threatening tears. "Who has shown such faithful friendship when others turned away?" As they rose, Laney caught Christian's hand to help steady him. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through her chest. Looking around the unfamiliar room with its bare walls and worn furniture, she realized something surprising. The safety she felt had nothing to do with walls or locks, nothing to do with her beloved orchard miles away. It came from Christian's presence beside her, solid and true as an oak tree in a storm. "Try to rest now," she told him, helping him settle onto the bed. "Tomorrow will test us both." Christian nodded, reaching up to touch the bandage at his temple. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That gives me peace." Lainey blew out the candle and lay down on her own narrow bed. In the darkness, she listened to Christian's steady breathing and the distant howl of a coyote. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But for now, in this moment, she felt stronger than she had in years. Not because walls sheltered her, or because her orchard waited at home, but because Christian's unwavering spirit had awakened something in her own heart, something she thought had died with her husband years ago. Hope, she realized. Hope in the courage that comes from knowing you don't stand alone. The county courthouse loomed before them the next morning, its red brick walls stark against the pale winter sky. Lainey smoothed her best black dress with trembling hands as Christian helped her down from the wagon. His own steps were unsteady, but determination showed in every line of his face. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Railroad men in crisp suits clustered near the front, their confidence evident in their easy smiles and casual gestures. Behind them, familiar faces from town filed in, the mercantile owner, the banker, the preacher, and dozens more. Some avoided Lainey's eyes while others stared openly at Christian's bandaged head. The judge, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed spectacles, called the room to order. The heavy wooden gavel echoed through the suddenly silent chamber. Lainey's heart pounded so hard she feared others might hear it. The railroad's attorney rose first, a tall man in expensive suit. He presented deed after deed with flourishing gestures, speaking of progress and prosperity. "This railway spur will bring new life to our region," he declared. "We cannot let one widow's sentimentality over an old orchard halt the march of civilization." Whispers of agreement rippled through the crowd. Lainey felt her courage wavering until Christian's hand found hers beneath the table, steady and warm. "Mrs. Collier," the judge called. "Your response?" Lainey stood slowly, her legs shaking. The treaty papers Samuel Red Elk had entrusted to her felt heavy in her hands. She unfolded them carefully, spreading the aged documents on the court table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, stronger. "These papers show a treaty signed 40 years ago, promising this land to the Ute people, with rights to gather fruit maintained even after settlement." The judge leaned forward, studying the documents through his spectacles. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Lainey saw his fingers drumming against his desk. She could feel the pressure in the room, the railroad men's cold stares, the townsfolk's restless shifting. "These are unusual circumstances," the judge said slowly. The railroad attorney started to speak, but the judge held up his hand. "However, a treaty is a serious matter." More murmuring filled the courtroom. The railroad men exchanged dark glances. Lainey felt her hope rising, then faltering as the judge continued to frown over the papers. Suddenly, Christian rose beside her. His face was pale beneath his bandages, but his voice carried clearly through the room. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" The judge nodded, though the railroad attorney scowled. "I am Christian Hochstetler," he said simply. "I have worked that orchard alongside Mrs. Collier. I have seen how she tends each tree with care, how she honors the land and its history. The treaty she shows you is not just paper. It is a promise to respect what came before, to be proper stewards of God's earth." The railroad attorney snorted. "And why should we listen to an Amish man who won't even carry a gun to defend himself?" "That is precisely why you should listen," Christian replied calmly. Because I choose peace, yet still stand here despite what your men did to me." He touched his bandaged head briefly, and a hush fell over the courtroom. Lainey felt strength flowing into her heart. She rose again, standing shoulder to shoulder with Christian. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong now. "I never expected to be here at my age fighting for my home. I thought my days of love and courage were past." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "But this orchard and this man taught me the Lord can plant again, even in the winter of our years. Those trees feed not just my family, but many in this room. The Ute people still gather fruit there as their grandparents did. It's more than just my land. It's a promise of how we can live together if we choose to honor what's right." Complete silence fell across the courtroom. Lainey saw tears in some women's eyes, thoughtful frowns on men's faces. Even some of the railroad men looked uncomfortable. The judge cleared his throat, removing his spectacles to polish them carefully with a handkerchief. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "This case requires careful consideration," he announced. "The treaty must be examined thoroughly, its validity confirmed. I will review all documents and issue my ruling once I am satisfied justice will be served." The railroad attorney started to protest, but the judge's gavel crashed down. "This court is adjourned until my decision is reached." Lainey's legs trembled as she gathered the treaty papers. Christian's arms slipped around her waist, supporting her as they turned to leave. The crowd parted before them, no one speaking, but their eyes followed the pair all the way to the courthouse door. 2 days dragged by like molasses in winter. When the messenger boy finally arrived with news of the judge's ruling, Lainey's hands shook so badly she could hardly unfold the paper. Christian stood beside her on the porch, steady as always, the words blurred before her eyes. "Treaty remains valid. Orchard to continue under joint stewardship with named Ute descendants. Railroad claim hereby void." Relief crashed over her. Like a wave, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she pressed the paper to her chest. Christian squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. "The Lord's truth prevailed," he whispered. Outside her gate, townsfolk gathered, shifting from foot to foot in the dusty road. Some couldn't meet her eyes, their faces red with shame. The preacher stepped forward first, hat in hand. "Mrs. Collier," he said, clearing his throat, "I reckon I judged too quick." "We all did." He gestured behind him, where wagons loaded with wooden boards and boxes of nails waited. "Thought maybe we could help rebuild your fence, if you'll have us." More neighbors stepped forward, the mercantile owner's wife with fresh bread, the blacksmith offering hardware, even children carrying small bundles of seedlings for the damaged rows. Their faces showed a mixture of regret and hope. Lainey wiped her eyes with her apron. "Much obliged," she said softly. "The orchard's always been here for all of us. That ain't changing now." They worked through the afternoon, hammering, digging posts, and replanting. Lainey noticed how some still watched Christian warily, but they nodded respectfully when he offered carpentry advice or shared his water jug. As sunset painted the sky orange and pink, the neighbors departed, leaving the fence whole again. Lainey and Christian settled onto her porch steps, watching fireflies dance among the apple trees. The evening air carried the sweet scent of early blooms. "I thought I'd live out my days alone," Christian said quietly, his deep voice gentle in the gathering dusk. "But the Lord gave me you." Lainey leaned against his shoulder, her heart so full it felt fit to burst. The orchard stretched before them, its trees casting long shadows in the fading light. Not just her legacy now, but their shared future, rooted in truth and blooming with unexpected love. Weeks passed, and spring breathed new life into Lainey's orchard. Fresh leaves unfurled on mended branches while apple blossoms dotted the trees like tiny white stars. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the rows as young Ute girls and boys played beneath the flowering branches, their parents gathering Early fruit nearby. Christian had thrown himself into building a new barn beside the orchard, his skilled hands crafting each beam and board with care. The structure rose steady and true, a testament to his patient work. Even folks from town would stop to admire his craftsmanship, some offering help or bringing cool water on hot afternoons. One warm evening, as purple shadows stretched across the land, Christian asked Laney to join him in the newly finished barn. He lit a brass lantern in the sweet-smelling hayloft, its gentle glow catching the silver in his beard. From his pocket, he drew out something that made Laney's breath catch. A simple wooden ring, lovingly carved with tiny apple blossoms. "The Lord has given us both a second spring," he said softly, his voice deep with emotion. "Let us walk these last miles together, hand in hand." Tears welled in Laney's eyes as she whispered, "Yes." Days later, the orchard hosted their wedding. Townsfolk gathered between the rows, while Samuel Red Elk stood tall beside the couple. His blessing joined their two paths, Christian's Amish faith and Laney's pioneer spirit, under the witness of heaven and earth. As dusk settled over the land, dozens of lanterns glowed among the trees like earthbound stars. Hymns rose into the twilight, German and English voices blending in harmony. Christian's strong hand held Laney's work-worn one, both of them marveling at love's unexpected timing. Standing amid the orchard's sweet perfume, Laney's heart overflowed with gratitude. At 60 years old, her life had not ended in lonely widow's weeds. Instead, it had bloomed again, as fresh and hopeful as spring itself. Like the ancient apple trees around them, their love had taken root in faith, flourished through trials, and bore the fruit of second chances. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.